Control time means jack crap if you don't do anything with it. It does create this sort of, Wizard of Oz, who's behind the curtain, what's going on behind the curtain, that creates a lot of distrust and misunderstanding between the judges and the media and the fan base. What's up, everybody? Laura Sanko here, and today I'm going to bring you my thoughts on the judging at UFC 282, but more importantly, and I'll probably spend the bulk of time talking about what I believe to be some of the issues with judging, some of the false narratives with judging, and I'm also coming with some solutions, guys, some solutions that at least I see as real possibilities. I'm going to try not to ramble too much on this one, but there are a lot of things I want to touch on. So off the top, the scoring at UFC 282. The easy one to talk about is the main event. And I've had a lot of people ask me about the main event and, of course, the Patty fight. And I'll talk about the Patty fight in a second. But the main event, in my mind, the result was the correct one. I had it scored rounds 1, 2, and 3. Round 1 was extremely close, but I had rounds 1, 2, and 3 for Jan Blachowicz, and I had rounds 4 and 5 for Ankalaev, but I gave Ankalaev a 10-8 in round 5. That to me is a textbook 10-8 round. And I'm going to do a video on, I know I keep threatening to, I'm going to do a video on 10-8 rounds pretty soon, but just off the top of my head, dominance, duration, damage, it had all 3 of those, which are the criteria that you need to have a 10-8 round. So ultimately the draw was the right decision in my judging opinion. So nothing too crazy there, to be honest with you. But the Patty fight. So off the top, the Patty fight, I did not have Patty winning the fight. I had Jared Gordon winning the fight, but I will say this, the fight was closer than, at least in terms of how the criteria is applied, than a lot of people would like to believe. Again, I did have Jared winning the fight. I definitely had Jared winning the first round. I think that round is probably the most clear of all 3 rounds. I had Patty winning round 2. I think that one's relatively clear. And then round 3, unfortunately, just kind of sucked. And generally when a round sucks, it's really hard to score, because when you are scoring on damage and impact, and there is very little damage and impact, then there's very little to score. And as I've told you guys in past videos, control time means jack crap if you don't do anything with it. So really what you are judging in that round are the shots that Jared and or Patty was landing in their various positions. Most of that round was spent against the side of the octagon. So I guess my takeaway from that one is, while I didn't agree with the ultimate decision, it's not as big of a robbery as many people are pointing it out to be. Now, 2 things came out of this fight that are real issues. I guess I'll start with the first one. There's one thing that came out of this fight that is a real issue. And I'll say this. I don't know Doug Crosby. I've never spoken to him. And frankly, I really didn't know a lot about his history. But part of the reason why this video is later than a lot of people, and I'm not going to be the first to the line with a lot of these things, because I like to take my time and really, I don't know, wrap my mind around the larger issues. Anyway, between when that happened and now, I've done a fair amount of research and understanding of Doug and his history. Again, I don't know him. I don't personally have anything against him, but based on what I've learned, he should not have been judging. And that's not even necessarily a subjective thing. So we can all have our opinions about people. We can not like how they do certain things, but there's one thing that happened in particular that should have kept him out, in my opinion, of judging forever. And that was when he judged the Al Iaquinta versus Jorge Masvidal fight. And everyone knew that he had a long-standing feud with Ray Longo. Of course, Al Iaquinta trains out of Ray Longo's gym. I know this as a judge, it's in your paperwork as a judge that you cannot judge fights where you have conflicts of interest. And you're not going to get a bigger conflict of interest than someone you have a bone to pick with. So he should not have been judging that fight. That level of incompetence should not be occurring. But I am going to say this, the narrative that that level of incompetence is running rampant through judging is not correct. Okay. That is an example. And again, it should never have happened, but it's not the standard. And I guess I have a little bit of an issue with people who paint the picture that there is just incompetence across the board to that level. And I'm going to talk about other forms of what people are labeling as incompetence later. But that type of incompetence where you can very objectively say he broke a very important rule and therefore should not be judging fights, in my opinion, ever again. Anyway, I digress. There are a lot of categories of issues or let's say topics within judging. And I actually wrote them down. I made a spreadsheet. So I'm going to read them to you. Number one, incompetence. We just talked about that a little bit. Accountability in terms of like, we don't know what happens to judges when they do screw up, like what happens. Well, I'll tell you, there are certain things that happen, but why does the public not know that? Transparency. Again, why does the public not know that? Why are the judges not allowed to talk to the media? And is there a happy medium? I understand some of the reasons why they're not allowed to talk to the media, actually. And I think that some of the reasons are good reasons. But it does create this sort of, Wizard of Oz, who's behind the curtain, what's going on behind the curtain, that creates a lot of distrust and misunderstanding between the judges and the media and the fan base. Criteria. The criteria itself is, in my opinion, I don't want to say it's flawed. It's very difficult to create a criteria to judge MMA. The criteria that we have now is pretty good. I would say I disagree with how some things are put in there, but I think for the most part, it's pretty good. Regardless, it is the criteria that we have, and it is the criteria that the judges are being trained on, and it's the criteria in which the judges are being told to score the fight. So don't blame the judges for the criteria. That is a whole other bag of worms that, because each state functions independently, is so incredibly difficult to change. Point system. We all know about the 10-point must system, how it was, sort of borrowed from boxing. And as MMA was growing from what was basically just this wild, wild west sport with no time limits and no rounds and no weight classes, as the sport needed to be legitimized, we took and borrowed from other sports, and the closest sport at the time was boxing. But there's a lot of differences in boxing, and one of the biggest is the fact that most boxing fights have 12 rounds and 3 judges. So that's 36 scores. Statistically, you're going to have a much better chance of having good scores the more scores that you have. MMA, you have mostly 3 rounds and 3 judges, so 9 scores. And that is a massive, massive difference. The headline, I guess, of what I'm going to say in this video is that math ultimately is the solution. Math is the solution. Greater numbers is the solution, but there are a lot of ways in which you can arrive at those greater numbers. And I think that some of them are, I think any change in MMA is really tough because each state functions independently. Some of these changes would not require massive rehauls and could be implemented relatively quickly. So let me go on with my list. Physical logistics, that has to do with where the judges are sitting, what equipment they're using. Inconsistency of scores, which I think is really points back to the criteria and the level of interpretation that is inherent in that criteria, such that you can have scores that are all over the place, but not necessarily wrong. So that the inconsistency of scores and the criteria itself are very related and interconnected. Pay. So one of the narratives that's out there is that judges get paid a lot. That is pretty easy to debunk. They do not. They absolutely do not. Judges at the highest level, judges who are consistently judging UFC pay-per-views at the apex of this career choice, make $1,500 a weekend. So when you do the math on that, If a person is willing to dedicate their entire life to judging, they're judging every fight, every weekend, they can max out around $60,000 a year. Compare that to officials in, say, the NBA. Now, I realize that officials or refs in that case and judges have very different functions of their job. I get that, but they're both officials and they're both a very integral part of the sport. And therefore we need people, we need smart people, we need motivated people to want to have that as their career choice. If you're starting out an official or a ref, I should say, in the NBA, you start around $250,000 a year. And if you're really good and you stick around a long time, you can make upwards of $600,000 a year. If you're really good and stick around in MMA, you max out around 60. That's a problem, because who wants to go into a career choice where that is your ceiling? You're not going to attract the smartest, brightest, best people with that. And frankly, the people that we do have should be applauded for having the job that they do, because, and this actually leads me into my next item, which is judging experience. So there's also a concept, or there's an idea that these judges aren't experienced enough. And let me explain how that sort of works. So when I became a judge, I took about I added it up earlier, but roughly 18 hours worth of coursework. And then I took a written test that involved, and then I took quite a few, I scored a lot of very, very intentionally tricky rounds as part of the test as well. The only thing that allowed me to do is be licensed as a judge. Now, I cannot actually judge in Missouri because I have way too many conflicts of interest. I did this as an exercise for myself so that I could say with certainty some of the things I'm saying right now. If I actually wanted to become a judge, here's what I would do. And here is what the journey of the judges who judge that Paddy Pimblett fight looks like. You spend years judging amateur fights, probably get paid $50 to go to a fight. You're driving yourself, you get no per diem, you show up, you get paid $50 for working for, 5 or 6 hours. Even at the professional level, so you have to apply to become a professional level judge, and you also have to apply in each individual state. There's no blanket body that is able to certify or license judges in multiple states. Even at the professional level, but I'm not talking about UFC pay-per-view level, but still the professional level, you're getting paid $500, $800, maybe $1,000. And that $1,500 number I threw out really is a somewhat recent phenomenon. So you can't tell me that these guys are doing it for the money. They're doing it because they love the sport, and because, that's really it. There could be no other reason, because I think we can all agree it's a very thankless job, and it's a job where on your best day at work, no one says jack shit. And on your not so great day at work, you get death threats in your DMs. That's not a career that a lot of people are going to choose when you're not getting paid very much to do it. The judging experience thing, also to add to that, when the UFC goes to a state where we do not go often, so not California and not Nevada and probably not New York, say Utah, for example, we show up in Utah. The most experienced judges, the names that you see quite often, and there are roughly, I would say, 12, maybe 15 top tier judges who are licensed in many, many states. And that's why you see their names consistently, whether we're in Nevada or we go to New York or wherever. However, when we go to those states, it is important for the local judges who may eventually become these pay-per-view UFC level judges to get some amount of experience. So they do put local judges on UFC fights, but they are relegated quite often to the prelims. But that is a thing. It's very much a catch-22. So it's really difficult to give people UFC level judging experience without allowing them to judge UFC level fights. So there are some amount of growing pains, I guess, there. But my main point to you is that if we're talking about the main card, especially main events, you are using judges that are the best of the best. Doug Crosby notwithstanding. Martial arts experience. There's also a narrative out there that none of these judges have martial arts experience. So two things with that. First off, that's not entirely true. I would say roughly half of the top tier judges I described, so roughly half of the 12 have either a black belt in jiu-jitsu, a black belt in karate. Some of them have fought in mixed martial arts. The reason why you don't have a lot of fighters who become judges is, first of all, the number of conflicts of interest, the thing I just said about pay, and it's a very young sport still. I mean, it doesn't feel young because it feels like I've been doing this forever, but in reality, it is. So when you take all those things into factor, you know, you're not going to have a ton of judges who had a long, storied mixed martial arts career who then went on to judge fights. Now, there are some. Chris Lieben actually just got licensed in California, licensed to judge professional fights in California. And I hope I can talk to him and pick his brain about what that experience was like. And then the last point, I guess, or the last column would be the lack of fan base, fighter, and coach education about what the scoring criteria is and how judging as a whole works. That I've kind of talked about before. I was reminded of it though, and I'm not afraid. I'm not throwing anybody under the bus because he actually said it on his show. But Chris Weidman had me on his show the day after the fights to kind of offer up my opinions based on the fact that, you know, I really do understand the criteria. And as I was explaining to him the you know, primary, secondary, and tertiary criteria, he was like, I didn't even know that. I had no idea. This is Chris Weidman, one of the greatest middleweights of all time. He, you know, he's part owner of a gym. You know, he's very involved in the sport. He is an amazing analyst, by the way. He is an incredible analyst. But even he did not understand how the criteria works. So that's part of it. Okay, now I'm going to go back and I'm going to talk about potential solutions for each of these categories. Number one, blatant incompetence, a la the Doug Crosby situation. Withholding direct conflicts of interest should result in you permanently losing your judging license. That should just be a thing. There is accountability, but not, in my opinion, enough. And I think that accountability should be made more public so that we, the fan base, and we, the broadcasters, and we, the media, have a level of trust that these things are being addressed and looked at. It does happen. So one example I can give is the James Krause versus Trevin Giles fight. Now, I know James's name's been in the media a lot, but this is not what I'm talking about. When James Krause fought Trevin Giles in, I believe we were in Houston, there was one judge who gave the first round to Trevin Giles, and that round has become known among the judges as one of the, if not the most poorly scored round in all of MMA. That judge was fired that night because of that round. Now, the result of the fight actually ended up being fine. I do think Trevin Giles won the fight. It was close-ish, but the first round, not even remotely close. But that judge was fired based on that one round. And you know that because there is a website where you can go and you can look and see every judge and every fight that they have judged at a certain level. So definitely UFC, definitely Bellator, definitely PFL. I think some Invicta, I think some amount of LFA is in there as well. So there is a tiny amount of public accountability in that website. I do think that there needs to be more public accountability in general, which leads to the issue of transparency, which I think is a huge one in MMA. Because again, we have this iron curtain between the audience, the fans, the media, the broadcasters, and the officials. I'm attempting to sort of be on both sides of that curtain, which gives me a really unique perspective on each of their ideas on how to handle things, which is why I think that there's actually a very happy medium in what we could do here. So you talk to the judges and you talk to the officials and the commissions. They do not want judges talking to the media. And I understand some of their reasoning. A lot of the judges I've talked to don't want to talk to the media. It has nothing to do with like, I don't want to own up to how I scored a fight. These people, first again, are not getting paid very much. Second of all, are already receiving an inordinate amount of flack for rounds that are quite often actually very close rounds, but everybody cries robbery. So it is a difficult thing to ask someone who spends the majority of their life as a school teacher, who thanklessly becomes an MMA judge on the weekend, to trot themselves out in front of the media to be in the crosshairs, which is why, because I think that even though they are often, most often, very credible, experienced judges who deliver good scores, they're not media trained. And a lot of these people would not be necessarily articulate in walking through why they made the decision that they did. But we can look to other sports. And in other sports, and I wish I had had this conversation before I made this video, but I'm actually going to talk to an NBA referee later this evening to get really detailed clarity on how they handle bad calls in that sport. I do know, though, that they have a liaison between the union of refs and the public, sort of like the way that the police have a what's called an public information officer. So the police force will have essentially a spokesperson who is the person who interfaces with the media and explains, why the police took the procedures that they did, what's going on at the crime scene, whatever it is. It would be very easy to have that type of person, a representative, a public liaison, for the judges as an entirety, come to the post-fight presser and explain why either that judge specifically or why that score could have been judged that way within the criteria. Or they might get up there and say, you know what, we screwed up tonight. We're going to take a really close look at these rounds, and there will be sanctions, penalties, whatever, that comes as a result of this particular round being scored incorrectly. I think any amount of public discourse from someone who lives on that side of the curtain would go so far, so far. Another, and I'm sorry I'm rambling here, but another tool I think would be relatively easy to implement and super important would be a rating system for judges. And we have MMA decisions, and that allows us to see every scorecard that judge has turned in for that year. So I'm going to use Sal D'Amato as an example because he is the most active judge in that roster of top level judges. And interestingly, I think Sal D'Amato is a very good judge. And if you talk to other judges, they will agree with me. But interestingly, because I live on the other side of the curtain as well, I would say that the perception of Sal is pretty good, but like not great. So I went to MMA decisions and I counted up how many fights he was involved with this year so far. And it was 113. And in that database, they highlight in yellow the times when he was a dissenting judge among the three. And there were, I gotta refer to my notes here, 6 times out of 113 where he had a difference of opinion in who won the fight. That's a 5% amount of the time when he had a difference of opinion. And keep in mind, it doesn't even necessarily mean that he was wrong. It just means that it was an extremely close fight. And a lot of these fights, none of us are worried about. We're not crying robbery with a lot of these fights because we recognize that they were close fights. So, that 5% then becomes, I don't know, I didn't have time to go back and look and see which fights I deemed to be truly close fights and which ones are really bad calls, but it's going to be less than 5%. That's a pretty good track record. I think that there needs to be a scoring system for judges that goes beyond, though, just the times when you are a dissenting judge. It needs to be round by round, because to my earlier point about the Trevin Giles versus James Krause fight, the result was fine. The result was the correct one, but that round was insane. And it turned out that that judge had a conflict of interest with, he had a tie to Trevin Giles, a fairly close tie. So that database needs to be expanded to not just the fight result, it needs to be rounds. And then as we start to put in place some of these other procedures, you know, you could adjust that judge's score, sort of like a credit score, based on how they're performing. And, you know, if you have a couple of bad calls, your score goes down. If you have a long track record of getting it right, your score goes up. You become an A+. I mean, we have this for so many other things. We've got Dun & Bradstreet for companies. We have credit scores. We have, you know, we've got freaking Yelp. There is a way to use large numbers of data to provide us with accurate results about a question. And that is what this video is ultimately about, large numbers of data. Which brings me to, I think, what is ultimately my point in this video. The 10-point must system works better for boxing because, as I said, you have 36 scores, 12 rounds, 3 judges, 36 scores. MMA, you typically have 9 scores. An easy thing to do that would absolutely magnify the amount of the sample size from which we are pulling would be to have more judges. And I'm not even saying that we use all of the scores. So stick with me here for a second. Imagine a world in which we have 9 judges. And 9 just so happens to be the number of judges that, say, for instance, judge Olympic figure skating, a sport where there is quite a bit of interpretation inherent in how the sport is performed. So 9 judges there. What if all of those 9 judges submitted scores for each round, and then behind the scenes, the outliers of those scores were taken out of the equation, and we don't even know who they were, and the judges don't know who they were. It is a completely black box which scores were outliers, and they get taken out. So when you take out the outliers, you end up with the scores that fall within this bell curve. Now, the more judges you have, the more accurate the center of that bell curve is going to be. In addition to that, the more options and tools you have to judge a fight will also increase that number. So if we would simultaneously change the scoring system from, instead of a 10-point must, to either a decimal system, or my suggestion and other people's suggestion, I'm certainly not taking credit for this because this has actually been attempted, would be the 0 to 5 point system. So for instance, a 5-3 round would be what is right now a 10-9 round where there was a clear winner, but it was not at all a blowout. So that's a 5-3 round. A 5-4 round would be what we don't have right now, which is the difference between a really close 10-9 round and a not so close 10-9 round. And then you could go down from there. A 5-2 round could be, oh, that was almost a 10-8, but oh, I'm not quite sure if it's a 10-8. A 5-1 is a 10-8, and a 5-0 is, Jesus, that was a 10-7. If you provide whatever the numbers are, honestly, it doesn't matter. Whether we start allowing people to use other numbers other than 9, 8, and 7, or we start using decimals like 9.5, it doesn't matter. It's the same thing. You have to give people more tools, and you have to have more judges. And ultimately, you end up with a much larger data set. You take out the outliers and you end up with a bell curve. Now, what's a way to interject even more numbers into that without making it insanely cumbersome? Because we all like to reference, and I do it too, how the media scored the fight. And I think on average, we have like 20-ish media members who end up scoring the fight. Now, on one hand, I would say, well, I mean, I don't know that I can trust that they really know the scoring criteria because they're not licensed judges. And how do I know that they don't have conflicts of interest because they're not under the same code of conduct as an actual judge? Well, the answer is they're going to have conflicts of interest, or probably would have conflicts of interest, and they may not know the minutia of the scoring criteria to the level that a top-tier judge would be. But what if those 20 media members, their scores were tabulated, the outliers on that were taken out, you get a bell curve from the media members, and then that becomes one of the 9 judges. There are so many solutions that can be explored that don't require overly massive overhauls in, equipment, or God, we got to completely redo the criteria, which I'm not saying that's off the table because I think that should be on the table. But anytime you can introduce a much larger sample size, you're going to get more accurate results. That is just a fact. And if you can do it without necessarily creating bad incentives for judges, and by that I mean like there's not this disincentive to be targeted when people don't understand the decision that you made about a particular round, when we don't even know who the outliers were and they're taken off. And there are, again, it goes, there's 9 of them, and maybe one of those 9 is actually a compilation of 20 media members. You get a much more accurate result. I feel like I'm beating a dead horse on that, but that really is, in my opinion, the real answer. The answer is math. The answer is a greater sample size of data points. Now, there are other things that I think need to be put in place culturally that would support the mathematical advantages of having a larger set of data. I talked about already the transparency, having a liaison with the media who would go out and explain why things were judged the way they were, or go out and say, you know what, this was poorly judged and here's what we're going to do about it. The point system, potentially 0 to 5, or another, I think, really viable possibility is judging the fight as a whole, which, by the way, takes away the need for open scoring, because you're not worried about, oh gosh, this judge scored it this way and now I gotta either rest on a lead or I gotta, I gotta compensate. It takes that out of the equation, and all of the concerns that the officials have over open scoring, which is in terms of like judges subconsciously wanting to compensate for when they were the dissenting judge, say on round 1, they're like, oh gosh, I didn't do the right thing. These other 2 guys scored it differently, so maybe I'll just sort of like compensate in this other round. You can't have that. You can't allow other people's judging opinions to influence your own, especially at this level. It should not be an influence, I guess, is my point. But if you're scoring the fight as a whole, you take the need for open scoring out of the equation. And I think it speaks to the origin of MMA, really. So when MMA started, there were very few rules, no rounds, and no time limits. Like, this was an experiment to see who would win a real fight, which martial art was the best martial art, because they would win as close as we could get to a real street fight. Now, as the sport was forced to become more and more structured, and I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, they had to interject these tools to make it palatable for the public and for the government to sanction it. And we can all remember John McCain, calling this human cockfighting. The UFC and MMA as a whole had to combat that in some way. And they did that by creating criteria and a scoring system and rounds and time, all of the things that we now use. But the fact is that, when we talk about a fight, we want to know who won the fight. I kind of don't care who won the rounds. If I can take myself out of the mindset of the only way that I've really ever watched MMA, although I have watched some Pride, and that's a whole different thing. If I can take myself out of that mindset, I really just want to know who won the fight. So if there's an instance where, round 1's really close, round 2 is really close, and round 3 is an absolute bloodbath, it shouldn't. The guy who got closest to finishing the fight should win the fight. And maybe that happened in round one. Maybe round one was the bloodbath and round 2 and 3 were super close. The guy who got closest to finishing the fight should win the fight. So that's just, so that's another idea. So imagine you could even do a combination of those things, score the whole fight, 0 to 5 point system or a decimal system, whatever we decide, 9 judges using the MMA media as one of the judges. If you start combining some of these tools, I'm not saying it would be easy to implement all of these at one time. It would be virtually impossible to implement all of these one time and highly confusing, I'm sure. But imagine a scenario where all those things did exist. You are going to get more accurate results. You just are. And that, at the end of the day, is what all of us want. It's what the judges want. It's what the officials want. It's what the commission wants. It's definitely what the fighters want and the coaches want and the fans want. We are all aligned on wanting MMA results to be accurate. Okay, so moving on. The sort of back to the, I guess, transparency piece of things, but also related to the judging experience piece of the pie that I talked about earlier. I feel like the commissions and maybe even the ABC needs to do a better job of publishing the requirements of what it is to be licensed as a judge. Because, when you talk to these judges, the judges at the highest level have, for the most part, by and large, over a decade of experience judging MMA fights. And there's also a narrative that, oh my gosh, these are all just boxing judges. No, they're not. No, they're not. There are like 3 boxing judges that have been grandfathered in, but they've been grandfathered in so long at this point that at least when you talk to the other judges, they are considered to be good, accurate MMA judges. And as time marches on, we're going to have fewer and fewer of those. But the fact or the idea that the majority of MMA judges are boxing judges is just not true. It's absolutely not true. Sal D'Amato is an MMA judge. Ron McCarthy is an MMA judge. I could go on down the list. These guys know the sport. And a lot of them hold, jiu-jitsu belts or various things. So to that point, I think in order for the fan base, the media, and the fighters to have trust that the judges know what they're doing, we have to do a better job of publishing the requirements that it takes to become a judge, and also, in my opinion, elevating those requirements. It's already a higher standard than what people like to think it is. But I do think more could be done in 2 particular ways. Required continuing education. Continuing education is available. It's readily available. There are more than yearly ABC meetings that people and judges can attend, where they essentially get retrained on the criteria. They're there to discuss and learn and further their education about being a judge or a referee. And this does apply to refs, although I'm obviously focusing on the judging piece of things as well, but some of these aspects do apply to refs. I do think, though, that there should be a point at which you have to pass an even more rigorous exam. And to my knowledge, this does not exist. The exam that I passed to become a licensed judge in Missouri, and again, I would be starting out at the amateur level. I'm not doing that. And the requirements that would take me to that professional level would simply be time in the game, number of fights scored. How did she do? Is she doing a good job? Did she have any weird, wacky scores? Okay, well, maybe we need to keep her at this level a little bit longer. You have to be approved to move on to the next level. And I think that at the highest level, there should be a much more difficult exam implemented for these judges. I think it's really, this is where I do agree with some of the fighters and fan base perception. I am not 100% convinced that all of the judges at that level could, for instance, discern between a straight ankle lock, a heel hook, and a toe hold. And maybe they could identify them visually, but knowing the angle at which that submission is finished so that you can determine visually whether that is a closed submission or not is super important. I think that the grappling in particular becomes really difficult, nuanced. And there are some fights I wish I would have, I wish I could give you a good example off the top of my head, but there was one on Contender Series that was just, I mean, it was like 15 minutes of scrambles and submission attempts that if you didn't know what you were seeing, it would be impossible to score it accurately. But you can't, you can't pay these guys absolutely nothing and require that they spend 10 years, um, you know, scoring at the amateur and lower pro level, getting paid $50 a weekend, and then also expect them to be a high level black belt. But I think that we can put in place testing that would weed out the folks who are so far from that level of knowledge that they should not be judging that level of fight. And I do think that that should be put in place. There you go. It was a very long video, but hopefully somewhat illuminating and informative for you guys. I would love to hear your thoughts on maybe something in this video that you never knew, never thought of, and more importantly, whether you agree with some of the ideas. Maybe there are pitfalls to these ideas that have not crossed my mind. Would love to hear that. So, this is a video where I would really enjoy you guys sounding off in the comment section about whether you agree with me and whether you have your own ideas. I want to hear it. So take the time, please, to write a comment if you have thoughts, and I would appreciate it, and I will read them, and I'll do my best to respond to you guys as well. So thank you for watching, and more to come. Keep it locked in right here, one-on-one. Like, subscribe, appreciate it. Thanks, guys.